Hi, welcome to the Indie Wine Podcast, episode 44. My name is Matt Wood, and today we'll be talking about Kate Field. She was an author, playwright, actress, and more. Her involvement in the wine industry was brief, but she's worth knowing about, wine connection or not. It's the case with a couple of the other women in our story also. Kate Field helped in the fight to hold off Prohibition. We discussed it quickly in the episode with Julia Ornelas-Higdon, but Prohibition wasn't an overnight change. It was threatened for years and decades even. Counties and cities going dry, saloon taxes enacted, bars shuttered, taxation laws around wine itself changed, especially with sweet wines. And when Prohibition finally did happen, over 40 years or so had gone by. It was the wets versus the dries. Here we go. Kate Field, the sort of a woman to be eccentric in her genius. I've looked hard to find stories of women involved in the wine industry during the pre-Prohibition era. There's not a lot, as far as I can tell at least. Writing, acting, and speaking engagements were one way women were really able to have their voice be heard at the time. So there was Frona Eunice Waite, who wrote Wines and Vines of California, which is a pretty incredible wine book. We'll talk about it in a future episode. There was also Kate Field. She wasn't directly involved in winemaking, but perhaps even more importantly, she was fighting for the very soul of American wine against Prohibition. Her name isn't known as much today as some of her contemporaries, but at the time her name was spoken of alongside Mark Twain and the Brownings and others. Kate Field was born October 1st, 1838 in St. Louis to Joseph and Eliza Field. Both her parents were well-regarded actors, and her father was also a noted dramatist. Kate's childhood was mostly uneventful, except for the tragic death of her younger brother, who passed away when Kate was 11. She always kept a journal as a child, filling it with precocious thoughts and musings. After Kate's father died when she was only 17, her and her mother would move in with a wealthy aunt and uncle in Boston. The Sanfords were millionaires and part of the high society of New England. They would support Kate financially, providing her access to some of the finest New England education at Laswell Seminary School. The company the Sanfords entertained included Edwin Booth, who was the greatest actor of the time, and Charlotte Cushman, one of America's first great actresses. Julia Ward Howe, who wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and her husband, Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe, who, in addition to helping the Union troops with disease prevention, was also an advocate for the rights of the disabled and helped finance John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. The Howes were very outspoken in their anti-slavery beliefs and frequent guests of the Sanfords. This is the environment that Kate came of age in. After spending 2 years in Boston, she was sent to Florence, where she met famed poets Elizabeth Barrett and Robert Browning, amongst other writers, novelists, and poets. It's here she began her professional career, writing for the Boston Courier, New York Tribune, and The Atlantic, becoming a columnist, many times focusing on her stay in Florence, but biographical sketches as well. Upon returning to the home of her aunt and uncle near the start of the Civil War, things would change and tensions ran high in the household. Her uncle was not a fan of abolitionists, and Kate thought John Brown was a hero. She gradually pulled away. Her financial support and eventual inheritance was pulled back also, pretty severely. A fall from horseback during this time would give her lingering health problems much of her life. Her writing continued, however. She published several editions of a book based on performances Charles Dickens gave on his trip to America called Pen Photographs of Charles Dickens Readings. She was a contributor of reviews and other work for the New York Herald Tribune. And she purchased John Brown's farm during this time, saving it and turning it into a memorial. Her career gained speed and became a whirlwind of new projects and adventures, filing over 100 articles with the New York Herald Tribune alone as a freelance journalist. She was soon giving lectures about the farm and Brown, and then lectures and eulogizing Dickens. On to England to give more lectures, Spain to write articles, and even meet the president. Back in London, she produced a play, sang on stage, and wrote more articles, including one on that new invention, the telephone, singing to Queen Victoria over the device and receiving a large amount of shares in the telephone company for her work. Back in the U.S., she went to Salt Lake City to investigate Mormonism. This would become one of her more famous lectures, especially in the East with its focus on polygamy and separation of church and state. Charles A. Wetmore of Cresta Blanca Winery in Livermore and the State Viticultural Commission first approached Ms. Field in the spring of 1888 about promoting California wines. She consulted with others before taking this Viticultural Commission appointment, writing to well-known men in the East where most of the lectures would take place. When they replied enthusiastically for it, she jumped in with both feet, ready to stand her ground and be attacked in the press. That August, she took the appointment. They paid her a reported $3,000 a year, plus an additional $500 for expenses. The extra $500 was suggested by John T. Doyle, the San Francisco lawyer you might remember from episodes 24 and 40. He was an early supporter of the university experiment stations, donating some of his Cupertino vineyard for planting new varieties imported by the Natoma Company as well as John Beltramo. He, of course, served on the Viticultural Commission as well. The other large item up for discussion at the Viticultural Commission meetings during this time was phylloxera and its devastation. Prohibition and phylloxera would be some of the toughest fights the wine industry ever had. Miss Field had first experienced the variety of California wines about 3 years before, while she was on the Pacific Slope, as it was called, touring California and other western states. She also had what she said were weird experiences in Prohibition states. As early as 1864, in the midst of the Civil War, she suggested native wines, although not necessarily Californian, be drunk instead of foreign to help reduce national debt. She was busy planning to start spreading the Gospel of the Grape, as her lecture was called. The title was changed at the last moment to The Intemperance of Prohibition. Quote, "I have about completed an address on the intemperance of Prohibition, which, as I am going to Washington soon for a visit, I may deliver it there for the first time. If these cranks knew as much about the Bible as they ought, they'd stop quoting it as I prove my side from the same book. Their two-wine theory, making biblical wine unfermented, is beneath contempt." Unquote. In Washington, she also met friends including Marvell Cooper, who had recently become chairman of a House committee. When he started, no California wine was served in their private club. Members saying, quote, "They'd be damned if they'd taste it." Field helped Mr. Cooper introduce Zinfandel, Riesling, Burgundy, Port, and Sherry onto the list, which all met with favor from the members. The Burgundy, Port, and Sherry were, of course, California Burgundy, Port, and Sherry. Field suspected they would spend about $3,000 a year now on California wines. When a reporter questioned her on why she was a boomer for California wines, she answered in part, quote, "While it is true that I usually drink hot water and have barely tasted any other beverage since my return to New York, it is also true that I have drank wine in moderation all my life, as anyone who is reared in Europe is sure to do. Moreover, I believe that as human nature craves a stimulant and will have it, all laws to the contrary, the best place for this stimulant is at one's meals, where it not only cheers and makes bad food good and good food better, but assists in digestion and banishes the arch friend ice water, which is one of the great factors converting us into a nation of dyspeptics. Now you see, instead of wanting to make drunkards of men and women, I want to keep them sober. I wish them to stop perpendicular drinking in bar rooms and take to imbibing light, pure, wholesome, cheap, native wines." Unquote. Her lecture was, quote, "novel enough to attract even the rabid prohibitionists, while it's certainly sufficiently alluring to command the attention of the vast army of moderate drinkers." Topics covered in the 1 hour and 45-minute lecture included how she came to write her lecture, prohibition in the past and the U.S., history of stimulants, alcohol as food, the Bible, abstinence, personal liberty, and more. 250 people heard it the first night. Doctors, politicians, members of high society, and scientists were all eager to catch a lecture. Senators and representatives were showing up to hear it for themselves. A vote of thanks was given by John McElroy of the National Tribune, which many seconded amongst rounds of warm applause. After the first evening, they drank still red and white wines from California at an informal reception. In the morning papers, it was called, quote, a rare treat, full of good things, and full of the most delicious sarcasm at the expense of the people who think they can make people sober by legislation, unquote. Her Iowa story led off the program. When she ventured there, you would need a doctor's note to purchase any alcohol, jump through hoops like signing an application, swearing that you're not in the habit of becoming intoxicated. She did sign it, but with a fake name, Sarah Jones. This is after she inquired if that's what people do, and receiving nothing but a smile back from the, quote, childlike and bland face of the druggist. Field's purchase was supposed to be of the highest quality brandy, but was anything but that. Her quote about the matter, the contents of a teaspoonful made me feel like I swallowed a torchlight procession. Carefully preserving the remainder, I presented it to an Eastern expert for analysis. Grain spirit and water, fusel oil, nothing from the grape. This is what a responsible Iowa druggist sold as pure brandy, unquote. Riverside, California, too, where she was unable to get brandy or any other drink at a formal dinner. But for $1, she could go to a physician, get a note, and then be able to purchase brandy in any drugstore. The mayor of the town also told her that beer was more plentiful than ever, but much of it of a worse quality. She followed it up by arguing any time something was prohibited, it made people more anxious to obtain it. Some statistics concerning Maine's recent prohibition followed. After she attempted to cajole the press into, quote, sounding the bugle call for temperance, not prohibition, which is the worst form of intemperance, unquote, the prohibitionists would mutter in disgust. From the other group attending, chuckles and laughter at the follies and applause were interspersed throughout as she held court alone on the stage. The non-prohibitionist side eating up everything she said. She discussed the 3 types of people in the world as she saw it: men, women, and cranks. Cranks could be men or women, she explained. Quote, what is a crank? A crank is a being who, having looked upon one object so long as to see nothing else, believes that this object represents the universe and that all persons holding different ideas should be legislated out of existence or otherwise suppressed, unquote. That received an especially large applause and especially large boos also. Representatives from the Women's Christian Temperance Movement, aka the WCTU, were present on this first night. They would be there most nights. They would even pass out prohibition pamphlets before shows on occasion. A high-ranking member, Mary Lathrop of Michigan, would reply to Fields the next night, arguing for a total prohibition. Also in attendance were Judith Ellen Foster of Iowa and Mary Hannah Hanchett Hunt, the superintendent of scientific temperance instruction for the WCTU. Under Hunt's guidance, the WCTU enacted an entirely new way of pressuring legislatures into enacting prohibition. It's been said, quote, it was perhaps the most influential lobby ever to shape what was taught in public schools, unquote. Although a private enterprise, it could seriously influence teacher training, and school textbooks essentially needed to be approved by Hunt if they were to be used. These were the cranks Field was describing. At one point, she described them as, quote, as great of a pest as the phylloxera. Wetmore and others defended her as she was attacked in the papers by newspaper columnists or Methodist clergymen. A good example was Reverend F.D. Bovard of the Park Street Methodist Church in Alameda, California. Some of his sermon went, quote, wine drinking is a menace to all civilized countries, and the only thing that will kill it is to make it a crime to good society. The wine men are making an effort to keep it popular in good society. Wine men have done everything possible to introduce their wine into society. They have obtained a brilliant woman to introduce their goods to the East. She must be denounced at all cost and be driven from society or the wine cup. She stands a hollow-hearted sham of no more use to the true woman of this country than a wax image, were she so harmless. This social monster must be driven from society." Unquote. President Harrison and the Viticultural Commission got some too. Harrison for drinking California wine at a banquet, and the Commission for leading what Bovard thought would be thousands of young men and women on the downward path of life with their World's Fair exhibit. The praise for Kate Field was unanimous in the trade papers of the day, calling her the talented lady and mentioning that the, quote, enlightenment she was giving them is of a class that has long been needed, unquote. Her lectures seemed to be working wherever she went in the eastern states. The prohibitionists would have their best women speakers follow her on this campaign trail of sorts. Most would speak at the same hall Ms. Field was at, but on the next evening and with an opposing agenda. Some states, like Massachusetts, had already gone dry, though she still did lectures there. Pennsylvania was a battleground state with a vote coming up soon after her speaking tour. The vote failed and Pennsylvania remained wet. Judith Ellen Foster, who we just heard about earlier, a dynamic and powerful woman in her own right, was the Iowa representative of the WCTU, and she expressed shock at Field in an interview. Quote, "I regard Ms. Field's attitude with regret. It is to me a shocking thing that any American woman should use the press or platform to uphold the sale of wine," unquote. Now, Foster had no issue with Field being paid by the Viticultural Commission. Foster herself and others were paid by groups with agendas, like the WCTU. It went deeper than that. Quote, "The pity of it is not that she is paid, but that she holds such views and endeavors to spread them," unquote. Field had no issue with being paid by the Vit Commission either. She'd been a lifelong independent journalist. She was paid to write and lecture, and she was one of the best. She made no effort to hide or disguise the payment in any way. Early in Field's run of lecture, she was endorsed by William Hammond, a prominent surgeon and the first American doctor devoted to neurology. He also served as the Surgeon General during the Civil War. She proudly wrote this to John Wheeler, CEO of the Viticultural Commission, who we've seen popping up in the Natoma and Ravenswood episodes, and we'll hear a lot more about soon. The Prohibition women would attempt to stop her other lectures as well, calling her a hireling of the wine men. They tried to prevent her from giving her lecture on Charles Dickens and another on Alaska at an upstate New York venue. The bishop in charge advised her to cancel her speaking engagement, which she did, stating that she would bear no animosity towards anyone, but that she would send a copy of the withdrawal letter to the press in anticipation of being attacked. Other attacks on her character would come her way as well, some saying she sold her soul for rum, or was often drunk in public and would go to, quote, "a drunkard's grave and thousands in hell will curse her," unquote. Some whispered that she even chewed tobacco. She didn't. Her journey through some of the Prohibition states really stuck with her, appearing in her lecture, but also often being repeated. The Iowa story would come up time and time again, one in Kansas as well. Prohibitionist men like John P. St. John would challenge her to debates. St. John was an early Prohibitionist advocate, winning the 1878 race for governor of Kansas on a Prohibition ticket. He proposed that he should receive $50 and Field $100 per debate. St. John had even been the presidential candidate in 1884 for the Prohibitionist Party, most likely drawing enough votes from Republican voters to split the vote and allow Grover Cleveland to become president. I didn't find any evidence the debates actually happened between the two, but I think it illustrates how much of a threat the Prohibitionists felt Miss Field was. The very top women and men of the temperance argument were the ones she was facing. She wasn't getting their B team. Others praised her, like a physician from New York writing to her, quote, "It will be a blessed day when pure California wines are employed," unquote. Wetmore received letters on her behalf too. One from a man saying a bottle of old California wine saved his wife's life when she could take no other nourishment. This man suggested they set up sampling depots around the East Coast so that others might be able to purchase samples to be drunk off-site as well. These prototype tasting rooms would benefit those who wouldn't set foot in a saloon. Attacks over the funding of Miss Field would even come from Washington Bartlett, then California governor, calling her salary extravagant. This attack caused her to defend her spending and then resign, which Wetmore refused to accept and pledged to shield her from further government interference. Quote, "I shall take the liberty on the part of our commission to decline to accept your resignation, notwithstanding the provocation you have received, and to assure you that the great body of the people of California and all her state's officials, excepting our accidental governor and boorish secretary, sincerely appreciate your invaluable services and are grateful to you for the warm friendship you have displayed towards our infant industries. We honor you foremost among the women of America, teaching right doctrine, elevating public sentiment, advancing social order, and pleading true temperance. The vine growers of our coast, who are now the pride and hope of California, will ever remember your brave adherence to their cause and their struggle against popular ignorance and prejudice." Unquote. There was some further grumbling that California wine should be introduced to persons in California before the East. The paper stated most in California hadn't even tried the wines. Wine dealers in New York had noticed a large change, though, and said that Field had, quote, "done a good deal for it here," unquote. He noticed that most of his customers for California wine had visited the state and tasted the wines and seen the vineyards. The suggestion was the same as many others, that California needed to concentrate on putting high-quality wines on the market and less wines that he felt should be distilled. His business had seen an immense growth in California wines over the previous 12 years. Most of that growth he attributed to better grapes being planted. To take it back to an early episode, this interview took place in 1889, just as the experiment stations of the university were getting going. Other independent folks thought it a terrible mistake for her to endorse wines, temperance, prohibition, or neither. A unique view on the matter Miss Field had was her spending much time in Italy and France as a youth and seeing the wine-drinking culture of the vineyard countries of the world. She often went back to this time when she was responding in the papers, noting that alcoholism was much more rare in European wine-producing countries. Despite being paid by the Viticultural Commission, she did often group beer along with wine when defending temperance. Occasionally, Ms. Field would also have dinners with the various samples provided to her by the Viticultural Commission. Mostly claret-style wines would be drunk, allowing those present to see how wine can accompany food. It was noted that her, quote, "eloquence is concentrated upon claret, a wine not much drunk except at mealtime. She often deems it necessary to feed the persons whose appetite she desires to direct," unquote. Usually these receptions would be held in the homes of prominent members of society. It would allow Kate to use a different side of her personality and her social ability, as well as her celebrity, to sell others on California wines and temperance. Of course, she would use the press as needed as well. In 1890, she established Kate Field's Washington, a 16-page national paper in a weekly format. Most of the writing was done by herself and discussed nearly whatever was on her mind: art, tariffs, women's suffrage, Washington politics, immigrant rights, culture, and prohibition versus temperance. She frequently worked herself to exhaustion publishing this paper. She had the backing of nearly the entire California wine industry with her paper. Quote, "The paper issued under the title Kate Field's Washington at the National Capitol by that able and versatile writer and lecturer Kate Field is at hand, and it is a publication of which Catherine should be proud. It is sprinkled with varied and entertaining matter, and is sprinkled with enough bright things characteristic of the editor to make it a very welcome visitor. It already has the support of several of the big California wine firms, and the good work that Kate has done for our wines in the East entitles her enterprise to the patronage of every wineman in the state. her paper may confidently be expected to do valuable service in combating that matchless doctrine of fraud and oppression, Prohibition. We welcome Miss Field and her paper to the ranks of honest and fearless journalism and wish her all possible success," unquote. The journal would proudly be full of her opinions on all the subjects we touched on earlier and more. "I believe that men and women are eternally equal and eternally different," she wrote on the eve of publication. Her fame was at its apex at this time, such that her arrival in cities would appear in the newspapers. In 1895, Field went to the territory of Hawaii, at first to rest, and then took on an assignment from the Chicago Times-Herald. She had wound down the journal after 5 years, choosing instead semi-retirement, staying in San Rafael, California for a time even. Her Hawaii dispatches were widely read as she commented on the conditions after Sanford Dole and others overthrew the Hawaiian monarchy. Dole was angling to have the U.S. annex Hawaii so sugarcane planters there could better compete in the global market. Field seems to have been in support of the annexation of Hawaii also. Traveling between islands in a storm, she caught an illness from exposure, most likely pneumonia. By accounts, she was going to one of the remote areas and had taken a keen interest in the people of the islands. She was a reporter to the end. David C. Todd, professor of astronomy at Amherst, and his wife, the astronomical writer Mabel Loomis Toddoff Amherst, were some of the last to have contact with Miss Field. As she lay dying, Mrs. Todd took down addresses and names of whom to send letters notifying them of Field's death. The Todds were on their way to Japan to view the total eclipse of the sun after making their brief stop in Hawaii. Kate was curious as ever, asking question after question of Mrs. Todd concerning their trip and the eclipse. The two women most likely had something in common. Mrs. Todd wrote the introductory essay and edited the first compilation of Emily Dickinson's poetry, in addition to editing or writing another 12 books in her lifetime. She was immensely talented in her own right, and on that trip to Japan, she would become the first Western woman to climb Mount Fuji. Kate Field was cremated as per her wishes. She was 57. She was called gifted, brilliant, generous. The New York Times said she was, quote, "one of the most versatile of her sex in this country," unquote. And the New York Tribune remarked she was one of the most famous women in America. Her good friend, fellow author, and later biographer Lillian Whitting helped in the carrying out of Field's last wishes. The trouble was mostly in getting the body back to the United States, as Hawaii was not yet annexed, and that certain people in Hawaii wanted Kate to be buried there. The Occidental Shipping Company, Southern Pacific Railroad, and Wells Fargo assured they would get the body anywhere in the U.S. for no charge. Her ashes were about to be buried near John Brown's body, but at the last moment, they were instead laid next to her mother's gravesite. Oh, the title today was from the San Jose Mercury in 1888, noting, in addition to her wine lecturing, she was also a brilliant actor and writer, amongst other brainy things. It's an admiring article for sure. Although hers isn't a household name anymore like some of her contemporaries, such as Mark Twain, during her time, as I hope I showed, she was definitely celebrated and sometimes criticized and well-known. The character of Henrietta Stackpole in Portrait of a Lady by Henry James was also modeled after her. Field's always had a little bit of a strained relationship with Mark Twain. I'll leave you with one last quote about her and temperance. Her ideas are that the cause of temperance and sobriety are best advocated by the popularizing of light wines. She spreads the gospel of the grape as the salvation of the people, and by this she has called down upon herself the wrath of many intemperate temperance people and prohibitionists. But she has persevered, however, and has opened a large trade for the product of California vineyards. She has taught the people that California wines were fit to drink and were superior in purity to many of the imported wines. Thanks for listening today. Kate Field was a name I kept coming across here and there when doing research for other episodes. I admit I didn't really know anything about her. It's funny how some names stay known throughout the years and others fade away and become so less well known or almost forgotten. There have been a couple books written about her, and some of her other writings, like pen photographs, are available online in the public domain if you want to follow up and learn some more. You can follow the podcast on wherever you're listening and the Instagram at Indie Wine Podcast. Feel free to email indiewinepodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or feedback. If you can tell your wine friends about the podcast too and help spread the word, I'd really appreciate it. Rating or subscribing helps too. There's also a Patreon if you choose to support the podcast monetarily to allow for more episodes and to help defray other costs like gas money and research book purchases. Any amount is appreciated. I have a small token of my appreciation to send to you also if you do. The link is in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode. Have a good one.